It started as a chance encounter in a quiet library. A young woman, a foreigner, miles away from home, falling for the wrong man. Viola, a bright-eyed student from Norway, never imagined her love for Frank, the married owner of a small-town library, would turn into something so dark, so deadly. But behind the library's peaceful facade, secrets began to fester. Frank wasn't just any man, he was a husband, a father figure. And one other person was watching their every move. Frank's stepdaughter, Julia. What Viola didn't know was that Julia's love for Frank had grown into a dangerous obsession. The moment she caught them together, everything changed. And in a brutal twist, a love triangle spiraled into murder. A crime so heinous, so carefully concealed, that it would shock an entire town. Tonight, we unravel the chilling truth behind the affair, the obsession, and the brutal crime that left one woman missing, and another fighting for her life. It began as an innocent story of passion, a foreign student in search of a better future, drawn to the mysterious charm of a much older man. But what no one could predict was how quickly that passion would spiral into a nightmare, one that would leave 2 lives shattered and a trail of blood across an unsuspecting town. Viola, a 22-year-old exchange student from Norway, arrived in the United States eager to immerse herself in her studies. A bright future ahead, an exciting new life in a new country. That was the plan. But plans have a way of unraveling, especially when desire takes control. Viola met Frank, a charismatic yet troubled library owner. Their connection was instant, intense, and deadly. Frank was older, married, and on the surface, appeared to live the perfect suburban life. But beneath that, he was a man living a lie, a man who couldn't resist the temptation Viola brought into his life. Their secret meetings in the back room of the library turned into dangerous liaisons. But secrets never stay hidden for long. What neither of them knew was that they were being watched. Julia, Frank's 18-year-old stepdaughter, was obsessed with her stepfather in ways that no one could have imagined. She saw Viola as a threat, a trespasser in her twisted fantasy. One night, Julia caught them in the act. That moment set in motion a chain of events that would lead to murder. The night everything changed, Frank snapped. When Julia confronted him about Viola, her jealousy boiled over into rage. Frank, consumed by fear that his life was about to unravel, made a fatal choice. In a moment of madness, he silenced Julia forever. But the nightmare had only just begun. Viola, unaware of what Frank had done, fled the scene, her heart pounding, her instincts screaming to run. She thought she could escape, warn the police, but Frank had other plans. He found her, dragged her back to his house, and locked her inside. What Viola didn't realize was that she wasn't just running from a man, she was running from a monster. And now there was no turning back. Frank's wife, Sarah, wasn't home that night. But when she returned, she had no idea what had taken place within the walls of their seemingly peaceful home. Frank had already cleaned up the blood, erased the signs of struggle, except for one crucial mistake. Julia's body was never found intact. Frank, in a cold and calculated move, dismembered her and disposed of the pieces in different locations across town. He thought he could hide his crime, but one clue would lead to his undoing. Days after Julia's disappearance, a passerby walking his dog discovered something chilling: the severed hand of a young woman, discarded in a trash bin like garbage. The police were alerted, and suddenly, Julia's missing person case took a deadly turn. Forensics linked the hand to Julia, but there was more. They found DNA under her nails, Frank's DNA. The investigation now pointed towards something far more sinister. But that wasn't the only mistake Frank had made. The library's security cameras had caught everything. The footage showed not only Viola's escape but Julia entering the library just moments before. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place, and the truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. The police stormed Frank's home, and what they found sent shockwaves through the community. The blood-stained clothes, the tools used to dismember Julia's body, and the chilling confession Viola was forced to make. But one question remained unanswered: where was Julia's body? That final answer would come when a local man, walking his dog near the woods, stumbled upon something horrifying: the missing remains. Frank's twisted game was finally over. The truth was out. The man who everyone thought they knew, the family man, the quiet librarian, was a cold-blooded killer. Viola, traumatized but alive, became the key witness in the trial that would send Frank to prison for life. But even now, the scars remain a haunting reminder that love can turn deadly, and secrets always have a way of coming to light. Frank, now a man cornered, realized there was no escape from the walls closing in on him. But his ego, the very thing that had driven him to pursue Viola and murder Julia, also fueled his determination to cover his tracks. The police may have discovered pieces of his crime, but they hadn't seen everything. Frank thought he could still play a game with the truth, twisting the narrative to suit his own survival. Viola, locked in Frank's home, could barely breathe. The weight of what she had witnessed was suffocating her. She had seen Frank kill Julia, seen the lifeless body of the girl crumple to the floor like a broken doll. And now, it was only a matter of time before Frank turned on her. There was a moment, late that night, where Viola's mind raced with thoughts of escape if only she could find a way out of the house, out of Frank's grasp. But her every move was calculated. She had to tread carefully, or else she would become the next victim. Frank's obsession with control didn't stop with the murders. He needed Viola under his thumb. He needed to ensure she wouldn't run to the police or expose the dark truth he was desperately trying to bury. So he devised a new plan to make Viola disappear, just as he had done with Julia. But this time, he wouldn't make the same mistakes. The tension in the house was unbearable, the air thick with the stench of fear. Every creak of the floorboards made Viola jump. Every glance from Frank felt like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. And yet, there was something even more terrifying at play. Frank's wife, Sarah, still had no idea what had happened. Sarah's absence had been the one saving grace, but Frank knew that time was running out. When she returned home, everything would change. He would need to find a way to explain why Viola was there, why Julia had disappeared so suddenly. He rehearsed his lies in his head, crafting a story that might hold up under scrutiny. But as the hours passed, Viola's will to survive only grew stronger. She knew she couldn't wait for Frank to make the next move. She had to act. In the dead of night, as Frank slept, she tiptoed through the house, searching for anything that might help her escape. Her heart pounded in her chest as she found herself in Frank's study, her eyes scanning the room for a weapon, a key, a lifeline. And then she saw a blood-stained shirt shoved hastily into the corner of the closet. The evidence of Frank's crime. Viola grabbed the shirt, knowing it could be the key to her freedom. But just as she turned to leave the room, Frank appeared in the doorway. His eyes locked on hers, and in that moment she knew the game was over. The confrontation that followed was one of desperation, fear, and violence. Frank lunged at her, his hands around her throat as he tried to silence her once and for all. But Viola fought with the strength of someone who knew her life depended on it. Somehow, in the struggle, Viola broke free, stumbling through the house as Frank pursued her, a knife in his hand. She ran toward the front door, her heart pounding in her chest, but the door was locked. In a panic, she bolted for the back of the house, smashing a window and hurling herself through it. Glass shattered around her as she hit the ground, blood trickling from the cuts on her arms and legs. But she didn't stop. She ran through the yard, into the streets, not knowing where she was headed, only that she had to get away. Frank followed, but his pursuit was slow, limping, as his earlier rage had taken a toll on his body. Viola, fueled by adrenaline and terror, managed to escape into the darkness. Meanwhile, the police were closing in on Frank. They had uncovered more evidence, found the bloodied remains of his clothes, seen the surveillance footage of Julia and Viola in the library. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place. By the time they arrived at Frank's house, he was nowhere to be found. Viola was safe, hidden in a nearby diner, telling her story to a waitress who had noticed her bleeding and offered to help. But Frank? Frank had gone into hiding. Days passed, and the search for him intensified. The city was on edge, knowing a killer was still on the loose. But the final twist came when Frank's own guilt betrayed him. Desperate and alone, he returned to the river where he had dumped Julia's body parts, hoping to retrieve what remained. But in doing so, he sealed his fate. A jogger, out for an early morning run, saw him near the riverbank, digging frantically in the mud. She called the police, who arrived just in time to catch Frank in the act. There, among the reeds and rocks, they found the last piece of Julia's dismembered body. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. Frank was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Viola, forever haunted by the events, returned to Norway, trying to rebuild the pieces of her shattered life. But the scars of what happened in that quiet town would never truly heal. For the residents, the story of Frank, Julia, and Viola would always linger in the shadows, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most innocent of facades. The town of Brookwood would never be the same after what unfolded. The discovery of Julia's dismembered remains near the river had sent shockwaves through the community, but the real horror wasn't just in the brutality of the murder, it was in the secrets that had been hiding in plain sight. Frank Harrington, well respected, seemingly ordinary, was nothing more than a facade. Beneath the surface, he was a monster who had killed not once but twice. And what made it even more terrifying was the fact that his entire life had been built on lies, deceit, and a desperation to maintain control over the women in his life. For Viola, the nightmare was far from over. She had escaped, but the trauma clung to her like a shadow she could never outrun. Every creak in the floorboards, every dark alleyway reminded her of Frank's hands around her throat, his cold, calculating eyes as he tried to choke the life out of her. The memories of that night haunted her, refusing to let go. But Frank wasn't the only villain in this twisted tale. As the investigation deepened, detectives began uncovering more about the web of lies that had held the Harrington family together. Sarah, Frank's wife, wasn't as innocent as she had seemed. She knew about Frank's affair with Viola, knew about his violent tendencies, and yet she had turned a blind eye, allowing the situation to spiral out of control. She had played her part in the cover-up, a willing accomplice to the horrors that had unfolded within their home. But even more shocking was Julia's obsession with her stepfather. The journals found in her room painted a disturbing picture, a teenage girl deeply in love with the man who would ultimately take her life. Julia had known about Frank's affair with Viola, but her jealousy had driven her to the edge. She had confronted them, believing that if she could expose the truth, Frank would choose her. Instead, it cost her everything. And then there was the final, gut-wrenching twist. Frank had planned it all. Julia's murder wasn't an accident, it was premeditated. He had known that Julia was growing suspicious, that she might expose his affair with Viola. But what no one expected was that Frank had been planning to kill both women, to silence them forever and keep his secrets hidden. Viola's escape had thrown a wrench in his plans, and as detectives pieced together the timeline, they realized just how close she had come to becoming his next victim. Frank's obsession with control was all-consuming. He couldn't stand the idea of losing power over the women in his life. In court, Frank showed no remorse. His calm demeanor, almost chilling in its lack of emotion, was the final straw. The jury didn't take long to convict him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, the terror he had inflicted on Viola, Julia, and the rest of Brookwood would never truly be erased. Sarah, left alone to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, would never be able to shake the guilt of what she had allowed to happen. And for Viola, the scars, both physical and emotional, would serve as a constant reminder of the night she barely escaped with her life. This was a tale of love turned deadly, of obsession, betrayal, and a darkness that none of them had seen coming. But even with Frank locked away, one question remained: how many more victims could there have been? In the days following Frank's arrest, authorities began looking into other unsolved disappearances in nearby towns, women who had vanished without a trace, with no leads to follow. And as more details of Frank's past came to light, a chilling realization settled in: this might not have been his first time. The dark truth. We may never know just how many lives Frank Harrington destroyed. But what we do know is this: the town of Brookwood will never forget the horrors hidden behind the walls of that quiet suburban home. Frank Harrington wasn't just a killer, he was a predator hiding in plain sight. Beneath his calm facade as the respected owner of Brookwood's local library, there was a darkness no one could have predicted. Viola, a young Norwegian student, was the latest victim of his twisted manipulations, having unknowingly fallen into a deadly trap. After months of manipulation, Frank's relationship with Viola turned sinister. When his stepdaughter Julia discovered the affair, everything spiraled out of control. Julia, obsessed with Frank and devastated by the betrayal, confronted them both. But instead of addressing the conflict, Frank chose to eliminate the threat. Cold, calculated, and without hesitation, he murdered Julia. But Frank's evil didn't stop there. He couldn't let Viola run to the authorities. As she fled in terror, Frank caught up with her, dragging her back to his home. With his wife Sarah conveniently out of the house, Frank brutally killed Viola, dismembering her body in a horrifying attempt to cover up his crimes. Over the next few days, he disposed of her remains in various dumpsters around the city, each piece a grisly reminder of the monster that lived in their midst. But even Frank couldn't cover all his tracks. Julia's body was found floating in the river, sparking an investigation that slowly unraveled Frank's web of lies. Surveillance footage from the library revealed everything: Viola's secret meetings with Frank, Julia's confrontation with him, and the moments before her death. The final blow came when a man walking his dog stumbled upon Viola's severed hand in a park. The police followed the trail of evidence back to Frank's home, where they uncovered blood-stained clothes and Julia's remains hidden under the floorboards. Frank was arrested, and during the trial, his horrific double life was laid bare. The man who had seemed like a pillar of the community was revealed as a cold-blooded killer. Viola's body was never fully recovered, but her hand, discovered by a local resident, became the key piece of evidence that sealed Frank's fate. In the end, Frank was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His wife Sarah disappeared from the public eye, too ashamed to face the reality of her husband's actions. Viola's family, shattered by the loss, returned to Norway, where they continue to grieve. Julia's death remains a dark stain on the town of Brookwood, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can hide in plain sight. This wasn't just a story of murder, it was the story of a family torn apart by betrayal, obsession, and the cold-blooded violence of a man who thought he could get away with it. As Frank sat in his cell, awaiting his final sentencing, the once respected librarian now faced the cold reality of his actions. The world he had so carefully constructed, one of secrets, manipulation, and murder, was crumbling around him. What had once been a quiet life, built on lies and betrayals, was now exposed for the monster that he truly was. But the scars he left on Brookwood were far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Viola's family, devastated by the loss of their daughter, fought for justice in every way they could. Her story became a symbol of the dangers that lurked in seemingly safe places. The quiet Norwegian girl, who had come to America to study and pursue her dreams, had met a tragic, horrific end. For her family, the pain of knowing her body had been dismembered and scattered across a city they hardly knew was unbearable. Back in Brookwood, the town reeled from the revelations of Frank's crimes. Neighbors who had once waved hello to him at the library were now questioning everything they thought they knew. How could such evil have lived among them? How could a man who appeared so ordinary, so respectable, have committed such atrocities? The horror that had unfolded in Frank's home left a permanent mark on the community. The police, determined to find the remaining pieces of Viola's body, scoured the city's landfills and parks. But as days turned into weeks, the hope of recovering her fully faded. Frank's cold, emotionless demeanor during questioning only added to the horror of his crimes. He showed no remorse, no guilt, only a chilling calmness that unnerved even the most seasoned investigators. Sarah, Frank's wife, was left to grapple with the reality of her complicity. For years, she had turned a blind eye to her husband's growing darkness. Whether it was out of fear or denial, she had allowed the horrors to escalate to an unimaginable level. Now, the weight of her silence pressed down on her, and she withdrew from public life entirely, too ashamed to face the community that once admired her family. The trial of Frank Harrington became one of the most shocking legal cases in Brookwood's history. The evidence was overwhelming: the security footage from the library, the DNA found on Julia's body, and the grisly remains of Viola, discovered piece by piece across the city. Witnesses testified about Frank's cold, detached behavior, his manipulation of the women in his life, and the chilling control he exerted over those closest to him. As the trial progressed, more dark secrets about Frank's past began to emerge. Investigators linked him to other disappearances in the area, women who had vanished without a trace, with Frank's name quietly surfacing in connection to their last known whereabouts. It became clear that Viola and Julia were not his first victims, and the full extent of his crimes may never be known. In the courtroom, Viola's family sat in silence, their grief palpable as the horrific details of their daughter's final moments were laid bare. They had come seeking justice, but no sentence could ever bring their beloved Viola back. In the end, Frank Harrington was convicted of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and dismemberment. The judge, condemning his cruel and calculated actions, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Frank showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his cold eyes staring straight ahead, as if nothing could touch him anymore. But for the town of Brookwood, the scars would remain. The library, once a hub of knowledge and community, became a symbol of the horror that had unfolded behind its walls. The quiet suburban streets, lined with well-manicured lawns, now felt darker, shadowed by the memory of the predator who had lived among them. Viola's story became a haunting reminder that evil can hide in the most ordinary places. She had come to America with dreams of a bright future, only to fall victim to a man who saw her as nothing more than another pawn in his twisted game. Her family returned to Norway, forever changed by the tragedy that had taken their daughter from them. Julia, too, was mourned by those who had once known her. Her obsession with Frank had led her down a dangerous path, but in the end, she was as much a victim of his manipulation as anyone else. And Frank? He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who walk among us, unnoticed, until it's too late. This wasn't just a story of one man's descent into darkness, it was a story of broken lives, shattered families, and the chilling reminder that sometimes evil hides in plain sight. Frank's imprisonment did little to bring true peace to the town of Brookwood. While justice had been served, the weight of his actions continued to hang over the community like a dark cloud. The chilling nature of the case, the way Frank had so carefully and methodically preyed on the women closest to him, left the town reeling with unanswered questions. How could they have missed the signs? How could someone so ordinary be capable of such monstrous acts? Viola's story became a cautionary tale for women across the nation. News outlets followed the case closely, dissecting every gruesome detail of her murder and the horror that followed. Yet, despite the publicity and the widespread coverage, it was clear that Viola's death had been senseless, a result of Frank's insatiable need for control and domination. In Norway, her family tried to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of their daughter's tragic end followed them wherever they went. Viola had been so full of life, her future bright and filled with promise. Now, her parents struggled to understand how their daughter had fallen into the grasp of such an evil man. Her father, in particular, had difficulty reconciling with the fact that they had sent Viola to America believing it was a land of opportunity and safety. In the end, it had only brought them heartbreak. Meanwhile, Sarah Harrington, Frank's wife, lived in her own personal hell. The media had painted her as either a complicit partner or a silent bystander, but the truth was more complex. Deep down, Sarah had always known there was something wrong with Frank. The subtle changes in his behavior, the coldness that seeped into their marriage, it had been there for years. She had chosen to ignore the warning signs, convincing herself that Frank was just stressed from work, or that his long hours at the library were a way to provide for their family. But as more details of his crimes came to light, Sarah's guilt consumed her. She had known about the affair with Viola, had seen how Frank manipulated and used her, and yet she had done nothing to stop it. And Julia, her own stepdaughter, had been obsessed with Frank, an obsession that Sarah had dismissed as harmless teenage infatuation. But now, with both young women gone and Frank in prison for life, Sarah had to face the reality that her silence had cost them their lives. Brookwood, once a quiet town where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors, was forever changed. The library, where Frank had spent so many years as a respected member of the community, was closed indefinitely, becoming a grim symbol of the darkness that had lurked within. The townspeople could no longer see it as a place of learning or refuge. It was now the site of nightmares, a reminder of the evil that had slipped through the cracks of their seemingly perfect lives. The media attention surrounding the case faded over time, but the wounds remained fresh for those directly affected. The discovery of Julia's body had been a breaking point for many. It was the moment when the full horror of Frank's actions came to light: the dismemberment, the deliberate disposal of her remains, the lengths he had gone to in order to cover up his crimes. But even with Julia's body found and Frank behind bars, there was still the lingering question of how many others had fallen victim to his schemes.